La suite de Médias en scène ici au studio 104 de la Maison de la Radio et de la musique. On va continuer à parler de confiance dans les médias, le rapport à ces médias. On va s'intéresser à un exemple étranger, cap sur les médias scandinaves, je vous le disais. Et pour animer cet échange, je passe la parole à Xavier Eutrope de l'INA. Bonjour Xavier.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup.
Très bon échange à vous avec vos invités. Et puis ce sera ensuite place aux questions avec le public tout à l'heure.
Super, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je m'appelle Xavier Eutrope, effectivement. Je travaille à la revue des médias de l'INA. Et cet échange va être en anglais. Il ne sera pas traduit. So I will begin right now in English. I'm doing a very swell transition. Today I'm here with Nic Newman from the Reuters Institute and Cathinka Rondan from the NRK. NRK is an acronym, so I'm going to say the Norsk Rikskringkasting, which is the national public radio service, radio and TV service in Norway. Thank you very much to both of you for being here today with us. We're going to try to talk about trust in the media, which is an incredibly difficult subject, and not a single country has the same situation as another. And so we are going to try and understand what's so special about Norway on this front, because as you know, we always talk about the Nordic countries as if they were very special, as if there was something magical about them on so many levels. And you have a very high trust in the media in Norway, as well as in Sweden and Denmark. But you've come from Norway, so we're going to try to learn things from you on this and try to see if we can replicate it here in France. But first, Nic, who works at the Reuters Institute, you've been there for how many years?
I've been there for 10 years.
10 years, after working at the BBC for 25 years, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the Reuters Institute is an institute that publishes yearly and all year long many studies and reports about the state of the media. There's the digital news report, and the thing is that you're asking a lot of people around the world what they consume, how they consume it, and also experts from the media. And right now you're going to do a little presentation of your own about trust.
Just 5 minutes or so, yes. So at the Reuters Institute, we look at news consumption across 46 countries using survey methodologies. But we've also done qualitative studies into trust as well, and I'll just briefly refer to those. So this is a general benchmark question we ask about trust, the extent to which people trust most news most of the time in different countries. And what you see here is this difference between the Scandinavian countries with very strong trust levels in general, led by Finland, but you can see Norway there as well. Some of the highest trust levels in our survey, and certainly in Europe. And then just to compare it with France, for example, just 30% say they trust most news most of the time. And also in other big European countries like the UK, Spain and Italy. And in the United States, we also have these very low levels of trust as well. And much of this is really to do with levels of polarization in society and these very bitter debates about politics and about culture, which are really raging in France and in the UK and elsewhere. So some of this is not about what the media is doing, but some of it is. Some of it's about other things as well. If we look, more specifically at trust in France, this is a fairly typical picture. We see trust is declining over time. So almost 10 percentage points fall, and you can see, for example, the impact of the Gilets jaunes protest in 2018, 2020, 2019. Again, this very bitter debate where the media was often seen as not being fair to one side or another, or was seen as being part of the elites, for example. And this is one of the reasons why we see falling trust. If you look at trust in media companies, you see that the public service media is more trusted than some other media. But across the board, we see very low levels of, or very high levels of distrust, and that has grown since 2018. So you see BFM there, so particularly with television, many people becoming more partisan or being seen to be more partisan. So these are some of the reasons. If you compare that with Norway, so one of the few countries where we've seen trust increase in our survey over time. And again, you can see COVID as being absolutely, I'm sure Cathinka is going to talk about this, COVID being a really seminal and important issue as people sort of came back to the media. But also if you look at specific brands, so I've just picked out NRK, the national broadcaster, 80% say that they trust, or give it a rating of 6 to 10, and only 9% say that they don't trust it, which means it gives it a rating of 0 to 4. So that's a much higher level than public media, for example, in France. Many people say, well, what do we mean by trust? This is a very complicated issue, as you've already said, and you know, there are lots of things that journalists talk about, you know, transparency. On the right-hand side of the chart, this comes from qualitative work we've been doing. It's much more about what audiences think about when they think about trust or distrust. Lots of factors, you know, sensationalism, accuracy, but the heart of it is really these 2 points. So people think that the media is not being fair, or conversely, they think they're biased against their political views, or they think that there are agendas, that the business owners or politicians have agendas. So effectively, this is all about whether the media is seen as being independent from business and political interests. And clearly, the Norwegian media is seen as more independent than the media in France for whatever reasons. We can discuss that in the slides. So just 2 other data points before I finish, so other differences between Norway and France. So I think trust is also very much linked to usage and engagement. And one of the things that we see in our survey when we ask people how interested you are in news is this very significant decline in many of the big countries in our survey. You can see the decline in France. Again, COVID seemed to be a really key point where we're starting to see news fatigue or people turning away because the news is always very negative. But again, in Nordic countries, we see the same trends, but not as steep, not as fast. So I think this is also related to trust in some ways, because people in Norway have this very strong connection to the brands. They're much more likely to go directly to a news website or app rather than to access it via search or social media. So that's another reason, I think, why this is declining less. And then this is obviously related to whether you're prepared to pay. So if you trust the media, you're more likely to pay for the media. So when we think about commercial payment, we find by far the highest level of news payment in Norway. Almost 4 in 10 say they pay for some kind of digital subscription or membership. And if you compare that to France or the UK, you know, it's more like 10, 11%. So 4 times as much. So this is also related to trust. Trust matters for public service. It also matters for commercial media. So hopefully some data points which will spark some conversation about the differences.
Thank you so much, Nic. It's very interesting and enlightening, all those data and all these ways of seeing the correlations between engagement and trust. And I was going to ask you what is trust, but you've touched on the subject right now. And the fact is that by saying that we could have the desire to say, let's just make it as is done in Norway. Let's just copy and paste. But it's not as simple as that, is it? And as we talked to prepare this talk, there were, I think, 4 parts that we agreed on, 4 ways of approaching the subject. And maybe I'm going to say that to you all. The first is maybe the state of the country in itself, what is done over there, how it functions, the way the media work and what they do, what the media could do. And also, what others needs to do, and others, meaning the politicians and such. And maybe we can try addressing the first subject, which is what is function of, Nic said this in a mail, what is function of a richer, better educated, a more interested in news society, and so on. So how would you say on this front, how would you say Norway is different than many other countries?
In the public? Or
yeah, public or yeah.
Well, I think for one thing, the thing about Norway is that if you talk about the news interest, we've also, the last years, also during the pandemic, been very focused on also constructive journalism. So it's not all dark, it's more, it's solutions and how can things become better and give hope and make people feel that they can make a difference, which is also important. But I mean, the rich or more educated isn't something the broadcasters can do so much about, but at the same time, a public broadcaster has a responsibility in children, and what kind of offering you make to the children. So that's one of the most important things at NRK is the offering we have for children, and also have news for children, which goes every day and which they use in schools. Many schools use this during lunch break, that the class watches the news together. And at the start of the pandemic, the government had the press conference only for children, where children could ask questions, which we also broadcasted at NRK. We have a political debate with the prime minister and all of the head of the parties, only for children. So that's the place where broadcasters can start to both, you know, not only conflicts, not only the dark things, but also constructive and solutions. So it does that because we see news aversion in Norway as well. Because, I mean, the world is a dark place right now. But you can try to do something to turn the trend in a way.
I mean, it's interesting that I'm just interested in why Norwegians seem to be so engaged with the news. Is it because they engage younger, or is it because people just feel that consuming the news is an important part of what it is to be a citizen in Norway? Because we're seeing a lot of people sort of moving away from that in countries like France and the UK.
And just to point out that in France, very few media try to talk to children directly. It's not something that is done. There have been attempts to do news shows for kids. À toi l'actu, par exemple, en France 3. But it's not something that it's been seen as successful or maybe interesting for journalists, I guess. So it doesn't exist in France, really.
I think to make some assumptions of some of the things we do different. It's kids, but I think also it's focus to you have to succeed with reaching young people with news. So both NRK, but also the other newspapers we have, they do quite a lot to become more visual or to present the news in a way that actually speaks to a 20-year-old and not only a 50-year-old with a high-paying job. In the news, we've also had this thing we've worked for years, which has been talk so a 19-year-old understands, or write so a 19-year-old understands. And very often what we see is we increase also in, all other age groups, because usually some media uses a language that can be a bit difficult to connect with. And the more approachable you are, I think also actually, sometimes I think media are afraid that you will lose trust if you have an easier language. But what we see is we increase the trust because we also increase the use. And use and trust also is linked.
But the fact is that also the media landscape in Norway is way different than what we have in France. And that's something we talked about by preparing, is that in France we have a lot of media, as in Norway you don't have that much media. But it's a smaller country also, but it's a smaller landscape, I guess.
And that you could probably talk more about how that affects us, but I think also it's fewer. It's a smaller country, which makes it easier. But I think it's also important that to cooperate between the media in the country, because it's in the global market we are now. It's very important to cooperate and take a common responsibility for the country's well-being. because nobody globally will do that for
yeah,
France.
I would say it's very much related to abundance. So in the English-speaking language or in France, you have so many publishers, news is coming at you 24 hours a day, and I think this is turning many people away. You know, it's reducing the value of news, and what you have in Norway is you have a very small number of publishers who have very strong connections with people, and they, you know, that relationship has traditionally been very strong in Norway, not just with the public broadcaster, but with you know, big brands like Schibsted, who really sort of try and leverage these big brands. So I think that's another sort of key part.
Merci Xavier, merci à vos invités. Voilà, je me permets de reprendre la parole simplement, il est 10h27 déjà, on va essayer de passer aux questions-réponses de la salle sur ce sujet effectivement de la Scandinavie, de la Norvège, d'autres exemples à l'étranger comme vous avez pu l'entendre. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle pour nos invités?
Vous pouvez les poser en français et je les traduirai.
Oui. Je voulais juste poser une question sur le prix de la presse en Norvège par rapport à la France, la proportion. Voilà.
Yeah, how does the sorry, I'm lost. Is the press pricey in Norway? How does it cost? How much does it cost to buy a newspaper or to buy a subscription to a TV channel?
Yeah, well, Norway is an expensive country, but a newspaper costs like 30 kroners. That would be €3.
Okay.
But also you have, you could say, if you talk about it's subscribing, of course, NRK as a public broadcaster is paid over taxes.
Yeah.
But Schibsted, you pay around 79 kroners a month for both the newspaper and the podcasts. But the digital newspapers are free, and then for TV media, it's around at €10 a month.
Okay. Nic, does paying for information have a role in the trust in the media? Does it?
Yeah, I think to an extent. You know, if you pay either by grants or license for public broadcasting, or you're paying for a product, then you kind of value it more. And I mean, some of one of the reasons for high pay in Norway is the very strong local sense of the importance of a local brand. The price of those is actually quite low, and they're bundled in increasingly. So you have national, local bundled together. And so, it takes a lot of the friction out of it. You have one subscription and you're getting all of this value. So I think that's another sort of trust-building part of the story.
But it's complex when the people don't want to pay for news, right? Because as we heard on a previous talk, it's in France. Not a lot of people want to pay for information.
It's always difficult to get people to pay for something you started giving them free. So in a way, that was not so clever. The whole world did it. But I think maybe Nic knows more about this. But you start by, in Norway, you started by taking paid for. Oh, you really want to read this article? 1 kroner, and then you kind of catch them in more and more. And as Nic says, the more you bundle, if you take you have all these in the local newspaper. And
podcasts, newsletters,
and you put work together. That's the cooperating part as well.
Allez, on va prendre une dernière question dans la salle. Il y avait une dame au premier rang, je crois, qui voulait poser une question.
Attendez le micro, juste
à nos invités.
Pour que tout le monde puisse entendre.
Bonjour, j'ai une question assez simple. Donc, vous avez dit que les journalistes en Norvège vont beaucoup plus parler aux jeunes et aux enfants. Est-ce que ça va surtout être des émissions d'éducation aux médias et l'information assez basiques, ou est-ce que c'est justement leur expliquer les conflits, les grands sujets d'actualité, les conflits géopolitiques à échelle d'enfants?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's about the question is about are the kids, the news kids show about media literacy, explaining to them how the media work, how to interpret an image, analyze it, or is it more to talk about international matters, what is going on in the world?
The news shows are news, what's going on in Norway and the world, but for kids, and since it's for kids, you often at the same time explain why it works this way, so you get both at the same time. It's news with an explanation in a way, because if you're talking to children, you also have to you can't take things for granted that they know things. So how both like, and also we talked about this earlier, especially now, especially in difficult times where there's so many people who disagree in war matters or other things in the world. Transparency in ethics, why you're taking the choices you are and why you're reporting the way you are, I think is very important. And I think you get that naturally when you make news shows for kids, because you know intuitively in a way that you have to explain to them why it's working this way.
In the UK, we also have, for many, many years, we've had a children's program the BBC produces called Newsround, and it's sort of built into the curriculum. So people kind of grow up with it, and the teachers discuss the news, whether it's, difficult subjects, but again, simple, but also giving a sense of hope as well, and light and shade in the news. Mm.
So I guess we have to start young, reading and hearing about the media, to trust them, as I guess we could say that.
I think it's very important to start young, because because then they will always come back in a way.
So that could be a message towards all the news channels in France. Do more kids news show. Est-ce que c'est bon pour nous?
C'est bon pour vous. Vous pouvez remercier vos invités, Xavier.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Et merci à vous, Xavier Eutrope de l'INA, pour cette table ronde donc, sur la Norvège, la Scandinavie et la confiance envers les médias. Merci à tous. La matinée qui se poursuit au studio 104 ici à la Maison de la Radio.